Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into a really fascinating thought experiment. We built this as a companion to 5-Minute Debate episode 233, which tackles the extent of Noah's flood, global or local. Now, when most of us picture Noah's Ark, we instantly envision the entire planet completely submerged in water. But today we're going to try something different. We're going to step directly into the ancient Israelite mind. We're going to put on their sandals, look at their maps, and read their language to figure out what this ancient text might actually be saying to them. Okay, let's dive into this. It's perfectly natural to read ancient texts through our modern 21st century lenses. We all do it, but I want you to pause and ask yourself a question. Do our modern assumptions about a planetary flood actually match the original author's intent? Or are we projecting this modern concept of a globe onto people who literally didn't even have a concept of a globe? So when people argue about the flood today, they usually bring up what we call the scientific debate, arguing over sedimentary rock layers, fossils, the age of the Earth, all that stuff. Well, today, we are putting science entirely aside. It is completely off the table. Instead, we are looking exclusively at the textual debate. We're going to map out exactly how a local or regional flood is argued, strictly using the biblical text itself, specifically looking at Hebrew vocabulary, ancient geography, and theology. Here is our roadmap for how we'll peel back the layers of this ancient text together. First, we'll look at the global or local debate. Second, translating all the earth. Third, the table of nations. Fourth, surviving giants and Nephilim. And finally, number 5, a theological recreation. All right, starting right off with section 1, the global or local debate. A lot of people just assume that arguing for a localized regional flood is a modern retreat. Like it's just a way for religious folks to backpedal because modern science makes a global flood kind of hard to prove, right? But what if that assumption is completely backward? The local flood argument isn't actually about avoiding modern geology at all. It's about reading the text in its original cognitive environment. It's about respecting the text enough to ask what those specific words meant to the people who originally wrote them down. Which brings us to section 2, translating all the earth. Now, what's really interesting about this is to truly get it, we have to look through a micro lens and analyze the specific Hebrew vocabulary used in the Genesis flood narrative. Take a look at the Hebrew word kol. It's usually translated as all or every. So when we read that the flood covered all the earth, we instantly picture the whole planet. But kol begs an obvious question: all of what? In the Hebrew Bible, kol frequently doesn't mean exhaustive totality. It actually just means all of a specific subset. And that brings us to the word it's usually paired with, eretz, translated as earth. Very often in the text, eretz simply means a specific piece of land or a local region. For example, in Genesis 41, the text says the famine was over all the earth, kol eretz. But it didn't mean penguins in Antarctica were starving, right? It meant the famine covered the known regional lands of the ancient Near East. And then we have ha, which translates to mountain, but get this, it's also frequently used in the Bible to describe a hill. The flexibility of these ancient words is exactly how local flood theorists argue that the text isn't describing a planetary submersion at all. Rather, it's describing a massive, unprecedented regional event that just completely devastated the local environment. To put that into perspective for a second, Genesis mentions the floodwaters rising 15 cubits above the mountains. Now, if you think Har means Mount Everest, well, you need a planetary ocean of water. But if Har refers to the regional hills of the ancient Near East, 15 cubits, which is a little over 20 feet, rushing over a local high hill, is an absolutely devastating, catastrophic regional flood. But it is very, very different from covering Mount Everest. Moving on to section 3, the table of nations. So now that we've looked at the micro level of vocabulary, let's zoom out to the macro lens. How do the ancient authors actually define the physical boundaries of their entire world? Well, Genesis 9:19 gives us a huge clue. It says, "These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed." Notice what the text itself is doing right there. It is literally defining the whole earth, specifically as the regions populated by the descendants of Noah's 3 sons. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point. Genesis 10, which is known as the Table of Nations, lists out those very descendants. And guess what regions are missing? North America, South America, Australia, China, the polar regions. The ancient authors knew absolutely nothing about these places. Genesis geographically limits the whole earth to the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the ancient Near East.
If that was their entire known world, a flood covering that specific region literally was a flood of the whole Earth to them.
Okay, Section 4, Surviving Giants and Nephilim. This textual framework naturally pivots us to one of the most fascinating, lingering mysteries of the whole flood narrative, the ancient giants. Now, if you're a careful reader of ancient texts, you know the Nephilim, the giant clans from Genesis 6, appear again later in biblical history, like when the Israelites enter Canaan. But wait a minute, how is that possible? If the flood covered the entire globe and wiped out every living thing except those on the ark, how in the world did the giants survive? Some ancient writers actually speculated that Noah must have been a giant or at least carried giant genetics just to explain this. But a regional flood is a real game changer here, and it easily solves this major textual riddle. It allows for human and Nephilim survival outside the localized Mediterranean flood zone. The giant clans could easily migrate into Canaan centuries later, entirely bypassing the need for complex, wild genetic survival theories inside Noah's Ark. Which brings us to our final point, Section 5, a theological recreation. Let's transition to the final and honestly, perhaps the most important layer of our explainer, the literary and theological purpose of the flood text. The ancient authors absolutely did not write this text as a geological textbook. In their cognitive environment, the flood story was actually a theological polemic, basically, a profound argument against the rival Mesopotamian gods. The story was crafted to prove that Yahweh, not the Babylonian deities, was the true master of the chaotic waters. It was written as a cosmic reboot of creation. So the crucial point is how perfectly the flood narrative mirrors the creation story. Just think about the striking parallels here. In Genesis 1, creation begins with formless, chaotic waters. Well, in the flood, the world is returned to the deep. In Genesis 1, the wind, or spirit, hovers over the water. In the flood, the wind subsides the water. In Genesis 1, dry land emerges for humanity, and in the flood, dry land emerges for a new humanity. The flood is actually a return to the temple-building language of Genesis 1. Let's see how this builds into an incredible theological arc. It's essentially a massive purification ritual of God's earthly temple. Step 1 is decreation. The polluted, wicked world is returned to watery chaos. Step 2 is cleansing. It beautifully mirrors the ancient Day of Atonement, washing away all the corruption. And step 3 is recreation, a fresh start, a brand new humanity stepping out onto dry land, commissioned once again to be fruitful and multiply. When we put aside our modern scientific debates and truly listen to the text in its original ancient context, a whole new world of meaning opens up. Whether you view the flood as global or regional, seeing the literary brilliance of the text is undeniably powerful. So I'll leave you with this. How does understanding the ancient context change the way you read familiar texts? What other ancient mysteries might make perfect sense if we just looked at them through the eyes of the original authors? Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll see you in the next explainer.